Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation will be somehow shorter and maybe simpler than previous ones, but I hope it will be interesting for you. Doesn't work. I am trying. Yes. Next slide, please. For the beginning, some basic information on Slovak forests. Forest area in Slovakia is more than 2 million hectares, which is 41% of land area, and it would be more than 45% the forests on abandoned agricultural land. Our growing stock is 480 million cubic meters, annual increment almost 20 million cubic meters, and annual felling is from 7 to 10 million cubic meters yearly, depending on the volume of salvage felling in particular years. In some years, it is salvage felling represent more than half of the total felling. 40% of our forests are state-owned. 52% managed by state enterprises, because our state enterprises manage also some private forests. A high proportion of Slovak forests are in protected areas of both national and European networks, mostly of IUCN classes 5 and 6, which means not very strict protection. Natura 2000 belongs to natural IUCN class 4. However, there is a significant effort to increase the strictness of protection with all consequences to adaptation to climate change. These are our forests in Slovakia, and now we can see our national parks, more than 300,000 hectares, then some protected landscape areas, some strict reserves and buffer zones of national parks. And on top of that, some Natura 2000 sites of community importance, and bird areas, special protection areas. Altogether, we can see that the proportion of protected areas in Slovakia is very high, and it somehow hinder our effort to adaptation to climate change. Of course, Slovak foresters believe in climate change, and here you can see, for example, a chart showing deviations of annual average temperatures from the long-term normal, calculated from the period of 1955 to 1980, and it is based on meteorological stations Hurbanovo, Košice and Liptovský Hrádok. Climate change impacts on forests in Slovakia is various, and we can observe, for example, increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events. This one is probably the most important in our country. I am talking especially about windstorms, but also about droughts and heat waves. Forest fires represent a minor problem so far in Slovakia, but in some years we have quite a lot of forest fires, and we put some effort to fire prevention and fire suppression. The most serious problem in Slovakia is that after these windstorms, when we have large windblown areas, subsequent bark beetle outbreaks follows. And thanks to higher temperatures, these bark beetle outbreaks are more frequent and occurs in higher altitudes than before. Originally, it was believed that bark beetle doesn't attack forests in subalpine vegetation zone, but now bark beetle outbreaks are quite common even in these high altitudes. We can also observe changes in tree species structure. For example, percentage of spruce decline from 26% in 2000 to roughly 20% in 2020. And this can be directly attributed to bark beetle rather than to increased temperatures and droughts. But of course, these increased temperatures and droughts are favorable for bark beetle population. Without climate change, we can believe that the occurrence of bark beetle would be much smaller in Slovakia. We can also observe, for example, sessile oak decline, which can be also attributed to droughts, tracheomycosis, but also to beech expansion. This one is quite strange because it should be expected, it would be expected that beech should decline under climate change conditions as well, but until now in Slovakia, beech is still expanding not only to higher altitudes, but also to lower altitudes. We can also observe some impacts of climate change on biological diversity. For example, alpine and boreal habitats are declining, especially Acidophilous picea forest of alpine and mountain levels, so-called Vaccinopicheta, alpine Pinus tembra forest, etc. These habitats are protected, for example, under Natura 2000 regulation, but now these habitats are declining with all impacts on nature conservation in Slovakia. Together with these habitats, also spruce-dependent and boreal species are at the risk. I am talking about many insect species, but also, for example, about capercaillie, Tetra urogalus, which is declining in Slovakia. And many times foresters are blamed for this decline, but we can say that before climate change, capercaillie was quite common species in Slovak forests, even in intensively managed areas. We can also observe impacts on timber industry. Spruce used to be the most profitable tree species in our country, and still it is to some extent. But thanks to these calamities, thanks to these natural disturbances, we're starting to have problems with the species, with all impacts on economy. We are also lacking capacities for the processing of hardwood. We can say that in the future, beech and maybe oak will be the most prevalent species in Slovakia, but our industry is not prepared for this, for processing of these new species, and it is more oriented to spruce processing. We can also observe impacts on recreation in forests. Visitors of our forests are less safe because of fallen trees and falling tree tops. Large and clear cuts are unattractive for visitors, and these clear cuts results from salvaging, or in protected areas we can see vast tracts of dead and uprooted trees, which is also not very attractive for visitors. Yes, in some small extent it is interesting for many people, but when it becomes common, it is public perceive it more negatively. Now some charts about the situation in Slovakia. In this chart, we can see the development of windstorms in cubic meters, which means the volume of timber damaged by windstorms since 1960 to the recent years. There were three major windstorms in Slovakia. Katarina in 1964 with more than 5 million cubic meters. Then Alžbeta in 2004. And the most recent one, Sofia in 2014 with 5.2 million cubic meters damaged. We can see that the trend of windstorms is increasing. After these windstorms, but Ipsilographus outbreaks are common, and we can see that the trend of them is also increasing. And we can see then that in the past, bark beetle outbreaks were quite rare. In the 60s and 70s, we can see that the volume of timber damaged by Ipsilographus was very low, but now it is high. And these last columns, red columns, means prognosis, and it is not very favorable for Slovak forests. Prognosis up to 2024. If we compare these main groups of harmful agents in the years 1960 to 2020, we can compare this abiotic damage with these three major windstorms, and we can see that after them, several years after, bark beetles follows, and that there was no subsequent bark beetle outbreak after Katarina in 1964. The most recently, we had some smaller windstorm in Slovakia on 14th of July 2021. It was unnamed and the volume is unknown yet, but it is about 1 million cubic meters, we can say. This chart shows salvage felling compared to total felling volumes from 1960 to 2020. We can see that proportion of salvage felling to total felling volume is increasing, and it is usually very high in the years of these large nature disturbances, large windstorms and after. In this chart, we can see deviation of annual salvage felling from the long-term average, and we can see that before climate change, it used to be below this average, but now all deviations are high above this long-term average. In the past, we only in the 1965, after large windstorm, the deviation was positive. It's quite difficult to say whether this is caused by climate change or nature conservation, because I have to mention that after in 2003, new Nature Conservation Act came into force, and in some national parks, large windstorms stopped to be salvaged with all consequences on bark beetle populations. But I can say that now current situation is caused by both climate change and nature conservation restrictions. Our forest will have to adapt in the future to several things. For example, firstly, to long-term changes in the climate, which means, for example, they will have to adapt to shifting seasonal water availability. In most regions, winter precipitation is projected to increase. Summer precipitation is likely to decline in Central Europe, and evapotranspiration or evaporation will increase, which means that the water availability will be even lower than it would correspond to precipitation. Our forests will have to adapt to increased variability of weather with more extreme events, as we could see at previous charts. But on top of the storms, also to prolonged droughts and floods, for example. And forest disturbances will become more severe, and we can talk about forest fires, wind, bark beetles, and other biotic threats. Generally, we have two ways out of this situation. In Europe, we can observe two different approaches to adaptation of forests to climate change. The first approach is close to nature approach. It is more popular, more welcome by public, but it is not the only one. This approach is based on establishing and growing more diverse and possibly most resilient forest stands. Generally, it is believed that more diverse stands will be more resilient, more adaptable to all effects of climate change. We can mention so-called assisted migration of tree species. There is no consensus if this measure is close to nature measure or it is more artificial one, but we can realize that it requires improvement of capacities of the whole reproductive material chain. The second possible approach is intensification of forest management and use of more intensive protection measures. For example, shorter restoration periods, because younger spruce stands are quite resistant to all harmful agents, especially to bark beetle, but they are also more resistant to high winds. And it could be some midterm solutions if climate change will not proceed too fast. This intensification also includes intensive prevention and suppression of pests, forest pests. And surprisingly, although this intensification can be a solution for the conservation of spruce-dependent species, because if spruce forests disappear, many species will disappear together with them. And if we want to protect these species for the biological diversity purposes, we need to protect at least some even artificial spruce, for instance. And on top of that, we have to adapt also forest management and timber industry, not only forests. For example, we can postpone plant felling in unmanaged areas to focus on salvaging damaged timber. We should restrict felling to winter seasons to prevent bark beetle outbreaks. We should increase capacity of landings and sawmills to cope with surplus amount of timber. How does policies address the challenges? In Slovakia, we had since 2014 cross-sectoral climate change adaptation strategy coordinated by the Ministry of the Environment, but there was no action plan prepared for this strategy, and it resulted in delay of adaptation in Slovakia. New updated strategy for adaptation of the Slovak Republic to climate change was adopted in 2018. This is also cross-sectoral strategy and all coordinated by the Ministry of Environment as well.
Mr. Schwarz, we would like to thank you, but we must interrupt you because we have still time going up. So if you can just maybe recap the whole presentation, maybe just say last few words, it will be good.
Yes, just quickly.
Thank you.
This action plan has many measures, but in general, these measures are
just make a quick recap. We must move forward. We are sorry, but if you can. Okay, thank you.
Yes, many of these measures are too vague and too formal. We have also some strategic documents in forestry policy, and we should realize that there is some scientific uncertainty in all these measures, and this uncertainty is as for the future climate as well as in its impacts, and adaptations may prove to be improper or insufficient. Maybe that's also some pictures. Yes, bark beetle in high Tatras, quite abundant, and thank you for your attention.